All right, so today we're diving into something that on the surface might sound a little bit dry, project risk management. But stick with us because this is really about so much more than just, like spreadsheets and Gantt charts.
Yeah.
It's really about understanding how to navigate uncertainty in any part of your life, really.
It is fascinating, isn't it, how we often kind of think of risk as this like negative thing. But in reality, it's more about recognizing that the future isn't like set in stone,
Right.
and that can actually be pretty exciting.
Totally. And to kind of guide us through all of this, we've got a lecture by Andy Furr
Okay.
who breaks down this whole art of managing project risk. Now, we're not trying to turn you into, project management gurus overnight.
Right.
Instead, think of this more as a toolkit for making smarter decisions, no matter what project you're tackling, whether it's planning a vacation
Right.
or making a big career move.
Yeah, what I find really interesting is the distinction Andy makes between risk and gambling. He defines risk as uncertainty that can affect outcome.
Right.
Which might sound pretty simple at first,
Yeah.
but there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, at first glance, it's like, well, duh, isn't everything uncertain?
Right.
But I think what he's getting at, that affect outcome part,
Yeah.
is really recognizing which uncertainties actually matter, and how they might influence the results of our actions.
Exactly. That's where this whole idea of calculated risk comes in.
Okay.
It's not about just blindly throwing darts at a board. It's about actually weighing potential outcomes, gathering information, and then making informed choices.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks here.
Okay.
Andy uses this scenario of a week-long outdoor adventure trip to Snowdonia
Right.
with 30 students.
Wow.
So let's imagine for a second we're the ones in charge of planning this whole thing.
Okay, yeah.
What are some potential risks that pop into your head? I'm already sweating thinking about the logistics.
Well, for starters, have you ever tried to coordinate that many postgraduate students?
Oh.
Herding cats kind of comes to mind.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, personalities and group dynamics, that's going to be a factor.
Right. And we're talking about Snowdonia. Ever heard of Welsh weather?
Oh, yeah?
I've been daydreaming about these epic hikes.
Right?
But what if it's just torrential downpours the entire time?
Yeah, that'll kill the mood.
Talk about a mood killer, right?
Weather is definitely always a wild card. Andy really calls out that kind of external factor as something to really watch out for. Things you can't necessarily control, like the weather.
Right.
He also mentions things like changes in technology or even sudden shifts in the market that can impact projects. Remember that whole energy crisis?
Oh, yeah.
And the collapse of bulb energy.
Right.
Those kinds of external factors can really, throw a wrench in the works.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got potential student conflicts, unpredictable weather, and these kind of looming external factors like the market, technology to think about.
Right.
How do we even begin to get a handle on all of this?
Well, that's where Andy's 4-step process for managing project risk really comes in handy.
Okay.
And he starts with identify risk, which sounds pretty obvious, right?
Right.
But it's about being really systematic in how you approach it.
Okay.
He suggests brainstorming, but not just any old brainstorming session.
Right.
We need to consider things from multiple angles. So think about internal factors first, things within our control, like making sure all our gear's up to snuff and we've got a solid itinerary.
Right.
But then there's those external factors we've already touched on.
Yeah.
The weather or, who knows, maybe even a sudden volcanic eruption in Snowdonia.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this goes beyond just hoping for the best.
Right.
But let's say we've identified a bunch of potential risks.
Okay.
Now what? Do we just start panicking and canceling the trip?
Well, that's where step 2 comes in, assess risk.
Okay.
We've got to figure out which risks are actually worth losing sleep over
Right.
and which ones are more like minor annoyances. And to do that, Andy really emphasizes considering both the likelihood of a risk happening
Okay.
and its potential impact.
So, for example, a minor sprain on a hike might be pretty likely,
Yeah.
but the impact isn't that huge if we're prepared. We've got a first aid kit, backup plans.
Right.
But something like, say, a major bus breakdown en route,
Yeah.
that might be less likely, but it could really throw the whole trip off track.
Precisely. And here's where Andy introduces a concept called detection difficulty, which basically means how easy is it to actually see a risk coming?
So something like a sudden downpour.
Right.
Pretty easy to detect. Check the forecast, right?
Exactly.
But what about, I don't know, a student developing altitude sickness? That might be harder to spot
Yeah.
until it's already an issue.
Exactly. And that early detection, it can make a world of difference.
Right.
Just like with a weather forecast, if you know a hurricane is coming, you can prepare.
Yeah.
But a sudden, undetected risk can really catch you off guard.
This is making me realize how much risk assessment we do in everyday life without even realizing it.
Right.
It's like when you decide whether to drive or take the train, you're weighing the likelihood of traffic versus the potential for, train delays.
Right.
And then factoring in the impact of each, like being late for an important meeting or just missing out on a few extra minutes of sleep.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to help us kind of visualize all of this, Andy uses a tool called the risk matrix.
Okay.
So imagine a grid with likelihood on one axis and impact on the other. And each axis is divided into levels, like low, medium, and high.
Okay.
And then you plot each risk in the appropriate box based on its likelihood and potential impact.
So let's try this out with our Snowdonia trip. Where would we put something like, I don't know, let's say one of our students, suddenly reveals they've never actually hiked before?
Well, depending on, the level of experience the trip is advertised for.
Right.
Discovering a participant doesn't meet those requirements, that could be a big deal. And since we're dealing with postgraduate students who may be, a bit more reluctant to admit they've fudged their experience a bit.
Yeah.
It might not be easy to detect this. No. So I'd say we're looking at, moderate to high likelihood there.
Okay.
And the impact could range from needing to modify activities to, worst case scenario, having to send the student home if they're truly unprepared.
Right.
I mean, we're talking potential safety issues, legal liabilities, a lot of logistical headaches.
Okay, so that one's definitely landing somewhere in the, pay attention zone on our risk matrix.
Definitely.
This visual is actually super helpful, like having a bird's eye view of all the potential risks.
Exactly. And once you've got your risks kind of plotted out like that, that's when you move on to step 3, develop risk response.
Okay.
And it's all about having a plan, not just for what could go wrong, but for what you'll actually do about it.
So instead of just passively accepting whatever fate throws our way, we're actually taking control and figuring out how to either prevent those risks from happening or at least minimize their impact.
Exactly. And Andy outlines 5 main response strategies: mitigate, avoid, transfer, share, and retain.
Okay, those sound a little jargony.
Right.
Can you break those down for me?
Sure. So think of mitigate like wearing a helmet while biking. Yep. You're not eliminating the risk of falling, but you're reducing the potential consequences. So for our Snowdonia trip, that might mean having really thorough safety briefings before each hike.
Right.
Or making sure everyone has proper rain gear.
Got it. So what about avoid? Is that just staying home and watching Netflix instead of braving the wilds of Snowdonia?
Well, in some cases, yes. If the risk is just too high and there's no way to effectively manage it, avoiding it altogether might be the smartest move. For instance, if the forecast is calling for, blizzard-like conditions during our trip, we might need to consider postponing.
I'm starting to see how this all kind of connects. Now, what about transfer? Is that passing the buck to someone else?
In a way, yes. It's about shifting the responsibility for managing a specific risk to another party. Think insurance policies or outsourcing certain tasks to, specialized contractors.
Right.
In our Snowdonia scenario, we definitely want to make sure all the students have good travel insurance.
Right.
That covers things like medical emergencies and trip cancellations.
So if someone twists an ankle, we're not stuck footing the bill for a helicopter rescue.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about share? Is that everyone chips in for a group first aid kit?
That's a good analogy. It's similar to transferring, but instead of shifting the entire burden, you're splitting it among multiple parties.
Okay.
So this could involve partnering with another organization or forming a joint venture. In the case of the Snowdonia trip, maybe we partner with a local guiding company that has experience with the terrain and safety protocols. That way, we're sharing the responsibility for things like route planning and risk assessment. Okay,
so we've got mitigate, avoid, transfer, and share.
Right.
What's the last one? Retain.
So that one's all about accepting the risk and moving forward.
Okay.
Usually when the likelihood or impact is low, or the cost of addressing it is just too high.
Okay.
It's about making a conscious choice to accept the risk.
So, for example, even with the best planning, There's always a chance someone might lose their sunglasses or get a minor sunburn, right?
Exactly.
Those are risks we might just choose to retain
Right.
because they're not going to, derail the whole trip.
Exactly. It's all about choosing the right response based on the specific risk and context.
Right.
And what's fascinating is that sometimes the best approach is actually a combination of different strategies.
Okay, so we've identified our risks, we've assessed them, and we've figured out how we want to respond.
Right.
What's the final step in this, risk management marathon?
So step 4 is all about control risk response,
Okay.
which basically means staying on top of things.
So it's not just a one-time thing. We need to be constantly checking in,
Right.
reassessing, and adjusting our plans as needed.
Exactly. Andy suggests using a risk register to keep track of everything.
Okay.
Think of it as a living document where you list out all your identified risks, their assessments, and your chosen responses.
So if the forecast suddenly changes, or we discover a new, potential hazard on our planned route,
Yeah,
we can update our risk register and adjust our plans accordingly.
precisely. And what's great about this is that it's not just applicable to project management. It's a valuable skill for anyone who wants to be more proactive and adaptable in life.
I'm already starting to see how this applies to so many things,
Right.
from planning a big move to even just deciding what to eat for dinner.
It's all about making informed decisions and being prepared for the unexpected.
And speaking of the unexpected, let's circle back to our Snowdonia trip for a second.
Okay.
We've identified some big potential risks, like those student conflicts, unpredictable weather. But what about some of the less obvious risks?
You're right. There are always those lurking variables that can catch you off guard.
Right.
What if, for instance, there's a sudden change in regulations regarding access to certain areas in Snowdonia?
Right.
Or what if the bus company we've hired goes bankrupt right before the trip?
Ooh, those are good ones.
Yeah.
And those highlight something that Andy emphasized, which is the importance of monitoring the external environment.
Right.
It's not enough to just plan for the risks we can anticipate. We also need to be aware of the things that could completely blindside us.
Exactly. And that's where ongoing research and staying up to date on, industry news become crucial. It's about constantly scanning the horizon for potential disruptions
Right.
and being ready to, adjust course if needed.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
Oh, how?
We've explored, the basic definition of risk,
Right.
the importance of assessing both likelihood and impact, and those 4 crucial steps for managing project risk.
We've also started to see how those concepts can be applied to, a real-world scenario like the Snowdonia trip,
Right.
which, by the way, is starting to sound both exciting and a bit terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I know, right? Don't worry, we've got a whole toolbox of risk management strategies at our disposal now.
That's right.
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into those response strategies
Okay.
and explore how to develop those all-important contingency plans.
Sounds good.
And we'll continue to use the Snowdonia trip as our guide, walking through some concrete examples of how to prepare for the unexpected
Yeah.
and navigate uncertainty like pros.
All right. Looking forward to it. So are we ready to kind of roll up our sleeves here and actually develop some risk responses for our Snowdonia adventure?
Absolutely, yeah. We've identified the potential pitfalls, assessed their likelihood and impact,
Right.
and now it's time to actually put together a plan of attack. Where do we even begin?
Well, let's revisit those response strategies that Andy outlined, mitigate, avoid, transfer, share, and retain.
Right.
Remember, choosing the best approach, a lot of times it depends on the specific risk and the context. Sometimes it might even involve a combination of these strategies.
Right, so let's take that potential for student conflicts that you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
How would we go about mitigating that risk?
Well, one approach could be incorporating some team building activities into the trip itinerary.
Okay.
We could have everyone participate in icebreaker games or maybe some problem-solving challenges that encourage collaboration and communication.
Ooh, I like that. It's not just about preventing conflicts. It's about building a sense of camaraderie
Right.
and trust within the group from the get-go.
Exactly.
And maybe we could even have a session on conflict resolution, equipping everyone with the skills to navigate disagreements constructively if they do arise.
Exactly. And having a designated facilitator or mediator who's skilled in conflict resolution could be incredibly valuable.
Right.
They could kind of help guide those conversations and prevent those, minor disagreements from escalating into major blowouts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's mitigating the risk of student conflicts.
Right.
What about something like that unpredictable Welsh weather?
Hmm.
Can we really, avoid that?
Unfortunately, we can't control Mother Nature,
Right.
but we can certainly take steps to minimize the disruption it might cause.
Mm-hmm.
Choosing a time of year with historically more stable weather is a good starting point. We might need to sacrifice those stunning autumn colors, but a slightly milder spring or summer could be a safer bet.
Right. And even then, we'd want to build flexibility into the itinerary.
Definitely.
Instead of locking ourselves into a rigid schedule, we could have alternative activities planned
Right.
for days when, hiking just isn't feasible. Maybe we have a backup plan for visiting a local museum, exploring a nearby town,
Right.
or even just having a cozy movie night in our accommodation.
I'm picturing a crackling fireplace and some hot cocoa.
Yeah.
That actually sounds quite enjoyable, even if it wasn't part of the original plan.
Right.
And speaking of plans, remember Andy's emphasis on contingency plans. These are those just-in-case scenarios we map out in advance.
Right.
So we're not caught completely off guard if something unexpected happens.
Okay, walk me through how we'd create a contingency plan, say, for a major weather event.
Okay.
Like a storm that makes hiking impossible for a few days.
So a good contingency plan, it always starts with a clear trigger. What specific event or threshold will activate this plan? In this case, it might be a severe weather warning issued by the local meteorological service.
Right.
Or perhaps even a consensus among our guiding team
Right.
that the conditions are simply too dangerous for outdoor activities.
Got it. So once that trigger is activated, what actions would we take?
First, we'd need to assess the severity and duration of the weather event.
Okay.
If it's a short-lived storm, we might simply adjust the daily schedule
Right.
and postpone those epic hikes until later.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a more significant event, like a multi-day blizzard,
Yeah.
we'd need to activate our backup plan.
Which hopefully involves that cozy fireplace and hot cocoa you mentioned earlier.
Right.
But seriously, wouldn't we also need to consider things like food and accommodation if the trip gets extended due to weather?
Absolutely. That's where communication becomes key. We'd need to contact our accommodation provider to see if we can extend our booking.
Right.
And we might need to arrange for additional food supplies.
Yeah.
And of course, we'd need to keep the students and their families informed of any changes to the itinerary.
That makes sense. It's not just about having a plan B. It's about making sure everyone involved knows what's happening.
Right.
And feels supported throughout the process.
Precisely. And that brings us to another crucial element of any contingency plan.
Okay.
Responsibility. Who's actually in charge of making those decisions
Right.
and communicating them to everyone involved?
Right. Because in the heat of the moment, we don't want to be scrambling around trying to figure out who's calling the shots.
Exactly. So before the trip even starts, we'd need to designate a clear chain of command and communication protocols.
Right.
Perhaps the trip leader, in consultation with the university's program leader, would have the authority to make those calls. We might even have a designated point person for handling communications with parents and families back home.
Okay, so we've got a solid contingency plan for a weather emergency.
Right?
What about some of those other risks we identified? I don't know, that potential for a student to suddenly realize they're in way over their head when it comes to the hiking difficulty.
Ah, yes, the never hiked before revelation.
Right.
That's a tricky one
Yeah.
because it involves both a detection challenge and a potentially high impact if it's not handled well.
So how do we, mitigate that risk?
Well, transparency and clear communication are key right from the start when we're advertising the trip and during the application process.
Right.
We need to be upfront about the level of fitness and experience required.
Okay.
We might even consider incorporating a pre-trip assessment, like a virtual interview or a questionnaire,
Right.
to gauge each student's understanding of the challenges involved.
I like that.
Yeah.
It sets clear expectations from the beginning and gives us a chance to identify any potential issues before we're all standing at the base of Snowden,
Exactly. And if, despite our best efforts, a student does find themselves struggling during the trip,
Yeah.
we'd need to have a plan for how to support them.
So would that be part of our contingency plan?
Absolutely. We could have a tiered system in place
Okay.
where, depending on the severity of the situation,
Right.
we could offer modified routes, additional support from our guiding team,
Yeah.
or even the option for a student to sit out certain activities if needed.
And of course, safety always comes first.
Of course.
We need to be prepared to adjust our plans if someone's well-being is at risk.
Right.
even if it means deviating from the original itinerary.
Exactly. It's about being adaptable and prioritizing the safety and well-being of everyone involved.
Okay, so we've covered mitigating and avoiding risks.
Right.
What about transferring risk? We already talked about travel insurance.
Yeah.
But are there any other ways we could apply that strategy to our Snowdonia trip?
Absolutely. Remember we talked about potentially partnering with a local guiding company? That's a great example of transferring risk. By relying on their expertise and experience,
Right.
we're shifting some of the responsibility for things like route planning, safety protocols, even handling emergencies.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
They know the area, they've dealt with these kinds of trips before, and they likely already have established safety procedures in place.
Right.
It's like having a safety net built right in.
Exactly. It doesn't mean we're completely off the hook, but it does give us access to a valuable resource.
Right.
And helps, spread the responsibility. And remember that sharing risk can be a powerful strategy as well.
Remind me how that one works again.
Sure. So sharing risk is similar to transferring.
Okay.
But instead of shifting the entire burden,
Right.
you're splitting it among multiple parties.
So in the case of our Snowdonia trip, instead of solely relying on a guiding company, we might also partner with the university, who are, after all, sending the students on this adventure in the first place.
Precisely. They might have resources we can tap into, like additional funding for safety equipment or access to their own network of experts who can provide training or advice.
This is making me realize how much collaboration and partnership play a role in effective risk management.
Definitely.
It's not just about going it alone. It's about building a network of support.
Right.
And leveraging the expertise of others.
Exactly. And that's something that applies to all aspects of life, not just project management.
Right.
Whether you're starting a business, planning a major life change, or even just navigating a challenging personal situation.
Yeah.
Having a strong support system can make all the difference in how you handle risks
and
overcome obstacles.
Okay, so we've covered mitigate, avoid, transfer, and share.
Right.
What about that last strategy, retain? When would we choose to just, accept a risk and move forward?
So, retain is all about making a conscious decision to accept a risk.
Okay.
Usually because the likelihood or impact is low, or because the cost of addressing it outweighs the potential benefits.
So, for example, we know there's a chance that someone might get a minor sunburn.
Right.
Or a blister on their foot, even with all the precautions we take.
Exactly. Those are risks we might just choose to retain.
Right.
We'll encourage everyone to wear sunscreen, proper footwear.
Right.
But ultimately, we can't control every variable.
Yeah.
And the cost of, say, trying to completely eliminate the risk of blisters by banning everyone from wearing hiking boots, it probably outweighs the benefit.
Right. We wouldn't want to create a whole new set of problems
exactly.
by trying to be too risk-averse.
Right.
It's about finding that balance between being prepared and being realistic.
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about risk management.
Yeah.
It's not about eliminating risk altogether, because that's impossible.
Right.
It's about understanding the risks, making informed decisions, and having plans in place to respond effectively when things don't go exactly as expected.
I'm already starting to see how this applies to so many areas of life.
Right.
But I have to admit, thinking about all these potential risks for our Snowdonia trip is making me a bit nervous. What if we miss something crucial?
Yeah.
What if, despite all our planning, something totally unexpected happens?
Well, that's where step 4 of Andy's risk management process comes in. Control risk response.
Right, the ongoing monitoring and adjustment you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Risk management is not a one-and-done task.
Yeah.
It's a continuous cycle of identifying, assessing, responding to, and monitoring risks. Things change, new information emerges, and we need to be ready to adapt.
So even with the best laid plans, we need to stay flexible and be prepared to pivot if needed.
Precisely. And remember that risk register we talked about? That's our tool for staying on top of things.
Okay.
We can use it to track all our identified risks, their assessments, and our chosen responses.
Right.
And we can update it as needed throughout the trip, adding new risks, adjusting assessments, and modifying our plans based on new information.
Okay, so it's like having a living, breathing document that evolves along with the trip itself.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how powerful this can be.
It's all about staying proactive, informed, and adaptable. And what's great about these principles is that they're not just applicable to planning a trip to Snowdonia.
Right. We can use them in any area of our lives.
Exactly. Whether you're starting a business, planning a major life change, or even just deciding how to approach a challenging conversation.
Yeah.
These risk management concepts can help you make smarter decisions, be more prepared for the unexpected,
Right.
and ultimately achieve your goals with greater confidence.
This is definitely making me rethink how I approach uncertainty. But before we get too carried away applying these principles to every aspect of our lives,
All right.
let's finish up our deep dive into Andy's lecture. You know, he presented risk management as this very structured analytical process. But what about the role of intuition and gut feeling?
Yeah.
How does that fit in?
That's a great question, and I think it's something that often gets overlooked in discussions about risk management. You know, while data and analysis are crucial,
Right.
there's also a place for that inner voice that tells us when something doesn't feel quite right.
Right, because sometimes you just have a hunch that something's off, even if the numbers don't necessarily back it up.
Precisely. And I think the key is finding the right balance between those structured analytical approaches and those, more intuitive insights.
So when is it appropriate to trust our gut?
Right.
And when should we, stick to the data? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in my experience, it often comes down to context and expertise.
Okay.
The more experience you have in a particular field or situation,
Right.
the more likely you are to develop, reliable intuitions about potential risks.
So, for instance, a seasoned mountain guide might have a gut feeling about the stability of a certain snowpack, even if the recent avalanche reports haven't shown any, major concerns.
Exactly. They've seen patterns, they've encountered similar situations before, and they've developed an almost instinctual sense of what's safe and what's not. But for someone who's completely new to the mountains,
Right.
that same intuition might not be as reliable.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between relying on a chef's intuition about how long to cook a steak versus trusting a novice cook who's just following a recipe.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And context is also crucial.
Okay.
If you're dealing with a familiar, low-stakes situation,
Right.
your intuition might be a perfectly valid guide. But if the stakes are high and the situation is complex or unfamiliar, it's probably wise to lean more heavily on data and analysis.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between choosing what movie to watch on a Friday night versus making a major investment decision for the movie. Your gut feeling about the trailer or the actors might be enough. But for the investment, you'd want to do some serious research and due diligence before putting your money on the line.
Precisely. And I think it's important to remember that intuition and analysis aren't mutually exclusive. They can actually work together quite effectively.
So it's not about choosing one over the other, but rather finding a way to integrate them.
Exactly. You might use data and analysis to identify potential risks, but then rely on your intuition to kind of gauge the severity or likelihood of those risks.
Right.
Or you might have a gut feeling about a particular risk that then prompts you to gather more data and investigate further.
This is giving me a whole new perspective on risk management. It's not just about, spreadsheets and checklists. It's also about tapping into our own experience, intuition, even our emotional intelligence.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about embracing the complexity of risk and finding the approach that works best for you, the situation, and your own unique set of skills and knowledge.
So to sum it all up, effective risk management involves a blend of careful planning, thorough analysis, and a healthy dose of gut feeling.
Yeah.
And it's not just about avoiding negative outcomes. It's also about opening ourselves up to new opportunities and possibilities.
Exactly. It's about taking calculated risks that align with our goals and embracing the exciting journey that unfolds when we step outside our comfort zones.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive so far.
It has.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the basic definition of risk to the importance of both, analytical and intuitive approaches. We've explored practical tools like the risk matrix and Andy's 4-step risk management process. And we've even applied those concepts to the, dare I say, thrilling scenario of planning a student trip to Snowdonia.
And through it all, we've uncovered valuable insights
that could be applied to, any area of life, from managing projects at work to making personal decisions.
But we're not done yet.
That's right.
In our final part, we'll delve into some more nuanced aspect of risk management.
Oh, great.